mad to think that you had people who were technically out of sync with what their church says God is okay with, and they are the ones putting together the report as to whether they can redecide what God thinks about marriage.
The moment you extract some portion of truth from love, it's no longer love. It's some smarmy thing that's not loving to do that. It's unbelievably unloving to kind of go along, to get along. It's cowardice.
In this moment we're in as a culture, and that was back in 2016. And that you could see where things were going. So I said, this isn't going to work. Students are going to find themselves muzzled. And ultimately, I found myself muzzled in the end as I felt a growing conviction to speak about these things publicly.
And it actually isn't supporting and caring for people who actually need to understand repentance is a part of the journey. It's a part of the path. Surrender is a part of a genuine gospel message.
We've been adopting a passive stance for too long, and we've been trying to avoid looking homophobic for so long. We've not realized that we've actually shifted in our convictions, and we no longer, it's as though we don't really believe it. It's as though we don't really believe homosexuality is wrong, and we actually believe it's just kind of good, and as long as you don't put certain parts of your body somewhere else, then God is just smiling upon the whole thing.
My former pastor used to say that he's concerned that so many in the church have become inoculated to the gospel. Like they're listening week after week. They've gone through all the motions or many of the motions, and yet their hearts are far from Jesus and they're far from surrendered. If therapy is so great and this should be helping people thrive, how is it that we have more anxiety, more depression, more suicide? How could we have the proliferation of therapy everywhere for adults and for children and be in the worst shape that we've ever been in when it comes to lack of connectedness? Well, hey, thanks for joining us for another episode of the Love and Truth Network Project. We're so glad that you're here. Glad that whether you're tuning in through Love and Truth Network or Transforming Congregations, that you've taken the time to join us. Today, I have Aaron Edwards with us, and Aaron's going to talk a little bit about his own story and unpack that for us as we typically do with guests. And he'll tell you a little bit about, he's not here from the United States. He's over in the UK, and we'll unpack that for us a little bit too. Looking forward to just discussing some cultural hot button issues and some important theological issues as well. So Aaron, thanks for joining us. Well, if you would just take maybe 10, 15 minutes, 20 minutes and just unpack your story for us a little bit, we'd love to kind of get to know you a bit.
There's all sorts of versions of different lengths of the story, so you can come and interrupt me if.
Yes.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, different versions would be a problem. Actually, that would be a whole other story. That's true. So I grew up in a. Well, I guess I was raised as I would say a nominal Roman Catholic, but maybe I wouldn't have said that at the time. I went through my Holy Communion and everything, and went to a Catholic school, but my parents got divorced when I was about 7, I think it was. And from that point, we stopped going to church, and it became increasingly a sort of fictional thing, almost for me, like a sense of, it was always there in the background, some vague sense of faith, but basically it wasn't something that we really lived out in our life in any significant way whatsoever. And except maybe going to midnight mass at Christmas time or something like that, and doing Easter in the way that anyone does in the West. But so for me, my experience of Christianity and religion, as it were, was just seen as quite boring almost. I remember just being told off for being too loud in the pew or whatever, and going along to Sunday school. And I remember filling in my Holy Communion book. As I said, after we stopped going, after a while, it kind of drifted off until when I was a teenager. We'd had actually a bereavement in the family when I was 12, just before I hit teenage years. I lost my 16-year-old sister to meningitis, which was a real tragedy for us and as a family. And it was very shocking especially because of how sudden it was. It was a particularly rare strain of meningitis, so she just had like a cold or the flu, and I still remember her sitting on a chair in the lounge asking me to go and get her some chocolate from across the road from the shop we used to live across the road to. And it was just like, she's unwell. And then she got that night, went into hospital, and then the next day she was just dead. And it was like completely shocking. So for me and my siblings, there were 5 of us in total, including her. It was a real trauma, and for my mother and father as well, of course, separated, divorced, and working all of that through was really difficult. And I hadn't realized that my dad, who'd been very strong rock for us during that time, coming and sorting everything out, the funeral arrangements and stuff, we didn't really know how he'd taken it. He didn't sort of, he did help us to grieve, but I don't think he really sort of showed us how much it affected him. And we hadn't realized that for many years he was then getting into cocaine and all these other things to sort of almost numb the pain for himself. And he woke up this is about 4 years later. He was on some kind of 3 years later it was, woke up after some binge where he'd been on in the week. Of course, we go to visit him at the weekend and he's all cleaned up and fine, but he'd actually been binging all week on whatever. And he woke up one morning in his lounge and turned on the TV and had one of those weird things where the God channel was on. I don't know if you have that in the US. We have in the UK, the God TV.
Yes.
There's all sorts of like questionable stuff on some of these Christian networks. But on this particular one, it was someone talking about biblical prophecy. And it woke up this kind of seed that had been sown in him in the 1970s for some chaplain when he used to work in a hotel on Jersey, which is a Channel Island off the UK. And this guy had given him this book about the Bible's prophecies, and he'd pretended to be interested all week to get a tip out of this guy. And the guy just gave him this book at the end of the week. So he read this book.
Right.
And it left something in him. He'd occasionally talk about it when we were younger, even though none of us were Christians, about the Bible, knowing stuff about prophecy in terms of the prophecies of Jesus and some stuff about the end of the world that I wouldn't subscribe to, and I don't think he would anymore. But it spoke to him in some powerful way. And that was about this. This show was about this, and he was too hungover to find the remote to change the channel, so he just watched it. Came to the end, and he went on an alpha course. He said, "Here's a number for the alpha course." Went on the alpha course, asked all the questions, etc. Got saved without telling us any of this, and then just announced that he'd become a born again Christian.
That is hysterical.
So one day we just found out, Dad's a
amazing.
born again Christian. So that means Dad's joined a cult, because we know what Christianity is. It's the kind of Roman Catholic thing where you just go along and no one really understands what's going on. That was our experience. And this was, kind of completely new. So we'd go along with him, and he brought us along to his kind of happy clappy, charismatic evangelical church. And we just thought we were entering in this other parallel universe. It was very strange. Myself, my siblings, and we were like, okay, this is where Dad's come with. But we did notice that he'd also had an amazing change, transformation. I'd now recognize as the work of the Spirit in his life, freedom in loads of ways, amazing. And he was, though he was good at leading us, as it were, evangelizing to us, he wasn't too strong, as it were. He had his wily ways, but he wasn't sort of like, we didn't feel like he was oppressing us with it at all. And we did say to him, look, we have enjoyed coming along with you and humoring you, Dad, but it's a bit embarrassing. You know, I'm 15 now. I don't want to be like saying I'm going to this big weird church. And so he said, that's fine. But, your mum's in Portugal for this 1 week in July, so I have to look after you that week. And I'm going to this Bible week. So that's what looking after you means that week. So I was like, oh, okay. It's like, and you're gonna. And I was going to turn 16 the next week. And technically, till you're 16, you're not allowed to be in the house on your own. So technically, you need to come with me for parental supervision. It's like, oh, I see. So he came along. He almost dragged us there, as it were. We were sort of reluctant, but he said, don't worry, you don't need to go to any of the Christian stuff. You can just go and play football, which over here you actually kick a football, and football, I'm a big fan of football, and going to gigs and all this coffee shops and stuff. So it's like, okay, there's lots of stuff to do at this kind of big Christian festival, and we'll go along and we'll just not let the Christians get to us. And that's what me and my siblings, we made a pact, and we said we're not going to let the Christians get to us this week. And then we got split up and got about the week and got to know all the people in the different youth groups and stuff. And then I ended up staying a second week of my own accord at this thing. They were doing another week, and my dad was going home with the other siblings, and I ended up staying, which is crazy. Missing my 16th birthday, which I had to explain to all of my friends, who said, why aren't you having like a drunken party like we've all had all year? And I was like, yeah, I'm at a Bible week. And I still hadn't made a commitment that week. I still resisted, and I didn't actually want God to change my life. I wanted to kind of have my foot in both camps, but I really liked these Christians. I was drawn to their love that I saw in their midst and the way they lived their lives. And I didn't quite know what to do about it, but I felt like I wanted to be there rather than somewhere else, and I couldn't really explain it. I couldn't even explain it to myself, but I just found myself signing the form to stay and work for free in this tent shop the following week. I didn't really know what I was doing, but it was then the following week I ended up finally giving my life to Christ when I came home, and my dad had been raving to everyone that I'd stayed of my own accord at this Bible week. And of course, he didn't mind the lack of parental supervision when I was staying there, before. He said, "Oh yeah, that's fine. You'll be fine with these guys." Like, okay. And then I didn't realize that my younger brother and sister who were with me, they'd already broken the pact, and they didn't tell me. They'd become Christians the first week and scarpered off home.
Oh my goodness.
And so there we were. And then, so our whole family testimony is kind of amazing, really, how that all happened. And then about a year or so later, my older brother, who was way off in Ibiza doing all sorts of drugs, he's an MC, a kind of rapper, the kind of rapper that you can't actually hear their lyrics, drum and bass rapping. Very good lyricist, but you just can't hear what the lyrics are. And he was out there, and then he ended up having an amazing experience of God, got healed. He was deaf in one ear because he'd been going to raves up close to a speaker since the age of 12, and he got healed amazingly, and then became a Christian, became a hip-hop evangelist. So his lyrics became more understandable and more cleaner, as it were, than they used to be. And so that was amazing. So our whole, in a way, God kind of saved our whole family in a period of a couple of years in a really bizarre way. So that was kind of amazing.
That is amazing. It reminds me, actually, I'm just going to interject real quick. I have a friend years and years ago when she was also being drawn to the Lord and drawn to church, but scared to death to go in, afraid the roof was going to cave in when she walked in the door, that kind of thing. And she actually sat in the parking lot and smoked a joint to be able to work up the nerve to actually walk into the church and meet Jesus. So, it's, I guess however we get there, but God is merciful.
Absolutely.
There's no doubt about
God
that.
is very, very gracious and very merciful. Yeah. So from that point, we, as I said, I always felt a calling. We all have in different ways to sort of mission and evangelism, myself, my siblings, and my dad, really in different ways. I found myself drawn to theology as well eventually, and I did an undergraduate degree actually first in literature because I wanted to be involved in writing, which I still have a calling to, and then did some postgraduate stuff in literature, but then also I did an MA in theology as well, and then ended up doing a PhD, and really not quite knowing at each stage precisely how it was going to pan out. I didn't have a clear career path or plan from that point. I just felt I was praying and seeking God and for his in the next kind of steps and direction, and sensing his leading in it. And so doing the PhD, I wasn't even sure I wanted to be an academic. I saw lots of problems in the academic world, and it was only halfway through my PhD that I really felt God giving me a clear sense of calling to that world. So I kind of went in with my eyes open rather than sort of fawning over the academic world and all of its sort of credentialism, which I think is a huge issue, and an issue that I saw, but felt that God weirdly for some reason had put me in that world. And so I ended up writing papers for conferences and eventually writing books and getting a position. I worked in the University of Aberdeen for a year in a part-time temporary position, and then got a full-time position at an evangelical Methodist college called Cliff College in Derbyshire in the UK. Derbyshire is where Mr. Darcy is from, by the way, in case anyone doesn't know where Derbyshire is. It's, and so in Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Darcy's from Derbyshire. And so,
yes.
It's a lovely place, a beautiful area, a national park. It was wonderful. And to have this evangelical college, which had such an amazing, rich history in Wesleyan theology and evangelism. And I was running the Masters in Mission program, students from all sorts of different backgrounds, but we were able to sort of, and the college was probably leaning to the left a bit, but was still had evangelicalism on the front burners in the policies, in the documents, in the history. And so though there were some issues, and the broadening of what evangelical meant was already happening, it was always helpful to be able to say, well, this is what the college's identity is. Like, so it was great. I felt that everything that I'd been schooled in my own church tradition, I could see there, even though I wasn't a Methodist, I could resonate with lots of the Great Awakening history. And people like Wesley and Whitfield were great heroes of ours in our churches. So yeah, it was an encouraging time, even though there was a huge challenge ahead, and I could see it was in order to sort of try to help the college maintain faithfulness to its roots, that would be was a challenge. And so I was able to have some success in sort of influencing that, especially in the areas that I had control over and influence over, as it were. And hopefully it was a blessing there to students. But obviously I was more conservative than others on some of these key issues. And so what happened around, I would say, 2017, 18, as this first conversations are starting to happen about Methodism going in the direction of same-sex marriage. And our college's principal was one of the people appointed to the working party. There were 8 people that Methodism appointed to say, we're going to work out whether we can revisit the doctrine of marriage. And of this 8 people on this working party to produce a report for the Methodist conference, there's only one evangelical that was the Cliff College principal. And the rest of them were...
Again, these were
and the rest of them were,
yes.
Over half of them were already in same-sex relationships or marriages. Because by that time, Britain had already...
Ridiculous.
Just before the US, I think, maybe the year before, we'd gone for... we say that the US sort of sneezes and the UK catches a cold, but when it comes to liberalism, maybe it goes the other way around. We go ahead. Europe does something bad, and the US goes, "Oh, that's really cool. Actually, let's do that as well."
Exactly.
It was mad to think that you had people who were technically out of sync with what their church says God is okay with, and they are the ones putting together the report as to whether they can redecide what God thinks about marriage. Kind of insane. So this kind of big report came out called God in Love Unites Us, which is always how these reports go. The Anglican Church one is called Living in Love and Faith. They never just say, we want to make gay marriage a thing. They say, let's come to God in Love Unites Us. Like, okay, that's great. It sounds so lovely, but really that's what the whole point of it was, rethinking the doctrine of marriage. And it was...
And in the political space, the parallel to that in the political space is safety and protection.
Absolutely.
Everything is couched in the safety and protection language.
So it's a ruse that it kind of wins people over. And it's really an emotive battle, really. It will say it's about doctrine. They're kind of, well, maybe we can get some biblical scholars that can help us undermine this text or that text. And we looked through this report as faculty. We kind of made comments on it. And and the principal was really just there to really rubber stamp it. From the evangelical perspective. And I think it was probably a problem that he was even involved in that. He would say he's technically on the conservative side of marriage, but he wouldn't really come out to fight against the incursion of gay marriage. So it's almost like, what's the point of your conviction? Is it a conviction or is it not? And so really that was, all he was there to do was to make sure that they wouldn't force ministers to perform a same-sex marriage. And so already the negotiation was like, so passive. It was like, please, and the guys, the other 7 or the people on the other side were even like, well, we're not sure about that. Would we really be in unity if we weren't able to all do it? So it was almost like the negotiation tactic was like really strong from the progressive side, which meant the conservatives thought, oh, we've got a victory because we've got a conscience clause and they won't force us to do a marriage. I mean, you just think that'd be insane if they were able to get that through. So that's how it ended up. They put in this, they voted on marriage and they had the conscience clause and said, we're not going to force. So you're allowed to have 2 views. It's kind of called living with contradictory convictions was the phrase they came up with. And we can all live together in unity because God in love unites us, remember? Whatever you believe, it's fine. You can imagine just applying that to racism. God in love, you're a racist, but no, I'm not a racist. But God in love unites us. So let's just all get on. You carry on doing your stuff and I'll do mine. I mean, it's insane. It's just pick and choose whatever sins you think are okay in any given generation. And so we were involved as faculty, like, how are we going to respond to this as a college? And I was saying, look, if the Methodist Church goes in this direction and we don't make a clear statement as a college to say, okay, we're not going to be homophobic and attack people who have a different view. We get it to college so we can discuss different views, but this is the view of the college. This is the normative view. We have to make a clear statement that shows that our evangelical colours, surely. Otherwise, we're no longer an evangelical college. And that was always just swept under the rug. It was always kind of like, well, no. I said, look, you're not going to be an evangelical will not feel free to share what they really think. And if they do, they'll get in trouble. Oh, no, they won't, because God in love unites us, remember? We agree with different... Can I say... You just watch what will happen. And I'm thinking when I'm saying that, like, imagine a student is going to feel challenged. Because I had this in my first term at Cliff. There was a conservative student who confronted a gay couple amongst the students. There was already a couple who were cavorting in public, and that was quite offensive to the conservative students. They were like, you can't do this, right? Like, this is weird, right? I mean, I'm not that crazy saying in a Bible college that this shouldn't be happening. Two guys just kissing in the kind of lounge. And this student almost got expelled from the college for confronting them. And I had to come in and like defend him and support him. Luckily, I had a bit of political credit because I was new. So I was like, this is insane. If this is the guy that gets kicked out, and he wasn't being unfair or aggressive or unkind, he was just trying to reach out to brothers in Christ, as he would have said, and, you know, bringing some kind of godly love, truth in love. But he was the one who got in trouble, and it wasn't the other guys who were then quite aggressive to him. And so I just thought, this is insane. This moment we're in as a culture, and that was back in, I think, 2016. And that you could see where things were going. So I said, this isn't going to work. Students are going to find themselves muzzled. And ultimately, I found myself muzzled in the end, as I felt a growing conviction to speak about these things publicly, on social media and podcasts and things like that. I was getting involved in debates around the Church of England's blessing of same-sex marriages, which they were just debating at the beginning of, the end of 2022 and into 2023. And just getting involved in that, seeing the amount of gay vicars who are suddenly going, look, this is inevitable, get over it, it's coming. Stop even harboring some kind of traditionalist view. You just need to give it up and get over it. Like, some people are gay, get over it. And I just thought, that's not on. And we've been adopting a passive stance for too long, and we've been trying to avoid looking homophobic for so long that we've not realized that we've actually shifted in our convictions, and we no longer. It's as though we don't really believe it. It's as though we don't really believe homosexuality is wrong, and we actually believe it's just kind of good. And as long as you don't like put certain parts of your body somewhere else, then God is just smiling upon the whole thing. And so I then tweeted in February 2023, homosexuality is invading the church, and that evangelicals are no longer see the severity of this because they're busy apologizing for their apparently barbaric homophobia, whether or not it's true. And then I added, this is a gospel issue, by the way, because if sin is no longer sin, we no longer need a savior. And that was really my critique of the evangelicals who say, oh, we'll only come out to fight as long as if it's a gospel issue. But if it's just sexual ethics and stuff, maybe it doesn't matter. That's orthopraxy, not orthodoxy. So if they talk about the Trinity, we'll have a fight with them about that. But if they come and talk about this, does this really matter? Maybe stop being such a Pharisee and judgmental. And we've caused such harm to the LGBT community anyway. And it's like, look, if you actually have been like sinfully discriminatory against gay people, then absolutely you should repent. Like, I haven't seen any evangelicals in my own circles, at least, and I've been in lots of conservative evangelical circles. Mostly I've seen people falling over themselves trying to not appear homophobic at every juncture and trying to be welcoming and kind. And actually it's not, it's only meant that we've got weaker in our conviction, strangely. So I think it's good that we've been gentle and kind to people and tried to show them love. I just also think at the same time, it's meant we've not challenged the actual sinfulness of the sin. And that's sort of what was behind my situation, really. But why I tweeted that. And basically that led to a massive Twitter mob in the usual manner. And then the college denouncing the tweet within a couple of hours without telling me. And then I got suspended and fired 2 weeks later. And it was pretty shocking how quickly it all came to a head. But there we are. That was the story, really.
So, I mean, clearly the word tolerance was applied in your situation.
Ironically,
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm
One
being sarcastic,
tweets,
obviously. Yes. Tolerance.
One of the things they said was, in terms of like responding to my tweet, it was like, Cliff College is a place where we respect a diversity of views. And it was just like, this is insane how you're not aware of what you're saying right now.
Right. Except
Absolutely.
yours. Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the reasons that we named our ministry Love and Truth Network. And we often say, look, if you take the moment you extract some portion of truth from love, it's no longer love. It's some smarmy thing that, and I understand what it's like to desire that. I understand what it's like to desire for someone to tell me what I want to hear. But at the end of the day, it's not loving to do that. It's unbelievably unloving to kind of go along, to get along. It's cowardice. And it actually isn't supporting and caring for people who actually need to understand that Jesus requires, Jesus paid it all, but repentance is a part of the journey. It's a part of the path. Surrender is a part of a genuine gospel message. And when that's taken out of it, and we just enter into a cultural Christianity, a form of Christianity without the life of Christ in us, then, my former pastor used to say that he's concerned that so many in the church have become inoculated to the gospel. Like they're sitting, they're listening week after week. They've gone through all the motions or many of the motions, and yet their hearts are far from Jesus, and they're far from surrender.
You think of the way that Paul regularly speaks about this, to the Corinthians, to the Thessalonians, and he's just talking about your false teaching and saying, well, let's see about these people, the words that they use. Let's talk about power. Let's see not just the things that they say, but let's see the power. And again, when he speaks to the Thessalonians, he's like, we came to you. Our gospel came to you not in word only, but in full conviction, the power of the Spirit. And so I think that's really, really key. And I think that part of that is sanctification as well. It's about seeing actual surrender, which leads to life change and repentance. And we, as you say, there is absolutely. I agree. There's an inoculation to the gospel. Ironically, a lot of the so-called gospel-centered language we've used in recent decades when the time has come, ironically, the gospel has not been applied in the right ways. It's often been applied in accordance with what the cultural left wants to happen, and that's partly the problem, that we've sort of demonized the right, and we just want to win the left, and that's kind of leads us to support some political causes that we shouldn't have supported and ignore quite significant issues over here, which as they pertain to pertain to sin as well.
For sure. And it seems to me that the reality of it seems like throughout the course of time and over generations, there's this constant pendulum swing of, going from one place to another. I mean, I think back on, what was referred to here in the States as the moral majority, way back in the day when I think it was Jerry Falwell who was leading that, and some other key leaders around the country. And I mean, I remember as a kid growing up and that being, the moral majority, having such a huge political, influence as well, certainly within in the right. And it was just, it's laughable and ironic to me that even to claim oneself as being a part of the moral majority, in a way that I feel like was missing the mark in terms of, one of the issues I think is going on in the church is this real embrace of license and sin, misusing the word grace rather than grace being, unmerited favor, but also empowerment to overcome sin, according to Titus chapter 2. And we're looking at it as just, God, kind of that God is just up in the heavens winking and not really worrying about what we're doing. And it's just this misuse of gospel language, misuse of these kinds of things. But back in the day when there was such a force to kind of be reckoned with, that was, claiming the moral high ground, and yet people were lying about and hiding their sin struggles. They're lying about and hiding. Nobody knows what pornography addiction is rampant in the church today, both amongst men and women, and in the pulpit, and as well as other forms of sexual sin. And one of our primary tenets of ministry, like both my wife and I come out of the LGBT world. We know hundreds of people that have come out of that to follow Jesus. And so we talk about that message, but what we're more concerned about, with me having been a pastor for 12 years, my wife being a licensed Christian counselor, we're far more concerned about the heterosexual, rampant sexual sin in the church that is a stage 3 or 4, cancer in the church that's hidden, not talked about. And meanwhile, we dress it up as being the quote unquote kind of moral majority. And so we've got these two polar views that are neither of them are actually functionally Christian. This kind of moral high ground and this self-righteous truth hammering kind of perspective. And then you've got all the license and supposedly where the love is at. But, truth is, if you happen to bump into truth, you don't want to bump too hard into truth because it could wound you. And so, we have those perspectives. But meanwhile, God does have a remnant in the church, and where we are called, Jesus was both full of grace and truth, not part of one and part of another. He was full of grace and truth. And we really need to, as a church, to repent, to become more vulnerable and open about the things we struggle with, to receive the help and support that he provides us in the gospel through his word and through community. At the same time, the whole point is this process of sanctification and deeper surrender, not just getting close enough to heaven that I'm okay with God while I sin as much as I want to. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever.
You're right that there's the part of the issue is of the pendulum swing is certainly, there was immorality hiding as the moral high ground. It's the hard thing with it is like on the, it can end up us thinking, the perfect balance then is the middle, which I don't think is actually the case, because that's actually a place too. And I think the middle has actually been the left.
That's true.
As well. Like recently, like it's been more likely to lead, like people haven't really been middle because they haven't really. So you've had pastors who've been like ignoring speaking out against, let's say, certainly transgenderism, which I think is easier to speak out against. I mean, of course, there are complex issues there, but homosexuality, they've barely touched in loads of ways, or if they have, it's been very, very hedged. And they would never touch feminism, for example, and then implications like abortion. So because though you've got the moral majority who've obviously been on the pro-life side for a long time in public, you've often had that disconnect in evangelical churches where it's like, let's not get into political issues and except, when there's a big political issue on the left, then we can kind of apologize for being white, or whatever, and that kind of thing comes in. You're like, hang on, I thought we were not doing the politics thing. I thought we were gospel only, and it turns out no, we're not actually gospel only. Now we're going to make this a gospel issue. So okay, well, if that's a gospel issue, are these things not gospel issues? Well, yeah, they are actually, and they are interrelated. I think sexuality is so. It's so, it's certainly bound up in the fiber of who we are as human beings. And that's why it's so difficult. That's why people, I guess, on the left of this issue will say, you're attacking me in my identity when you disagree with my sexual lifestyle or preference. And you go, yeah, I get why you're actually thinking that, why the lie you've been told about that particular sin is that you're being told that you can curate that and go in the direction of that. But I do understand how significant sexuality is to our humanity, and that's precisely actually why we need to be attacking these other issues, that these weeds that come up, whether it be pornography, whether it be the way in which people will cover up, as you say, certain issues while not practicing what they preach.
So many times when generations have passed and hundreds and many, many years have passed, we often do not remember, or unless we're a real student of history and then we're reading somebody who's writing authentically about history, we don't know what all of the reasons were, what the dynamics were, in ways that now we kind of look at it and just kind of do a broad brushstroke and just think, oh, that was horrible or that was wrong, and we don't have the full information. I think,
absolutely.
In some ways, that's kind of what you're saying.
It's easier for us to not understand history when we've been given a narrative that helps explain why things are okay now. Why don't you look back and actually study the Victorian England? Yes, there were loads of problems, but there were also loads of like really good things that we could learn from, and that we caricature them. And does anyone really learn, or do they just hear the headlines? And the headlines are quite convenient. And I'm not saying someone has to become an expert on history. I just think that when you see problems manifest, Jesus says, tell a tree by its fruit. When you're seeing lots and lots of bad fruit, you can't just keep going, oh, but the roots are fine. I mean, we mustn't have a look at the roots. We really mustn't, because we know that what the roots say. Right. Who told you that? Did they have a skin in the game here? Did they have a stake in telling you that those roots are fine and untouchable? Or maybe we should go and disturb the roots, because we just want good fruit. We want good things to happen. We want the best for men and women in all of society.
Right.
So it's not like people are trying to come and hurt people and harm them or subjugate people or oppress them or whatever for the sake of it. It's really just, what does God say? What does God say is fruitful and best for humanity, for flourishing?
It's so true. Yeah. And we're living, I mean, a couple of years ago with COVID, the election that was going on, and other riots here in the US. I mean, there was so much upheaval over many, many different issues. But I'm even thinking of, this idea that we need to tear down certain statues that represent things that people are saying are bad and all that. The tragedy of that is if we have a history, and of course we have a history that is checkered. Nothing is perfect about any nation's history. But why on earth would you want to remove all of those glaring, awful things and remove the reminder, get rid of them as if they never happened. And we have to somehow block them out of our mind rather than actually learning from them, which is, I think, also what you're talking about. It also reminds me, one other quick thing here, and I know you're in the process, Aaron, of writing a couple books, and I would love to talk about that a little bit, and also ways that people can follow you, get connected with you. But Abigail Schreier wrote a book a few years ago called Irreversible Damage, and talking about how girls in particular were really falling under this kind of groupthink and social contagion when it comes to rapid onset gender dysphoria, and she really unpacked that. And man, oh man, was she blasted for having the nerve to actually write about that topic and do such a great job on it. But she recently came out with a new book, just came out last year, which I've picked up. I heard her on a podcast, and I immediately went out and bought the book. And it's called Bad Therapy. And so she's writing about the fact and idea that, and this goes to the core of what you're saying too, this idea that, well, we can't look at the roots or whatever. How is it that we have more therapy? And my wife's a licensed Christian counselor. I mean, we believe in therapy, but how is it that we have more therapy? Certainly in the U.S., I'm sure around in many, many, many parts of the world, it's, we've shifted away from going to pastors and Christian leaders and others for wise counsel, even friends for that matter. And everybody is in therapy. I mean, so many people are now in therapy. How is it that when you have, if therapy is so great and people, this should be helping people thrive, how is it that we have more anxiety, more depression, more suicide? Why are all of the, and this is what she was asking herself, how could we have the proliferation of therapy everywhere for adults and for children and be in the worst shape that we've ever been in when it comes to lack of connectedness and all that? So her book is phenomenal in going back and really uncovering what is therapy actually for, and why are we sending healthy people who happen to just be sad or having a bad moment into therapy? It's actually doing damage to them.
And really helpful to hear you, as someone who's married to a counsellor, to even have a critical perspective on it, because some can protect that field and be so precious over it that, oh no, it's really, really important. And to the extent that it must be proliferate as it does across society. I agree. Abigail Schreier, I've not read her book, but I've come across it, and it certainly resonate with everything I've heard about it, and similar people who've argued similarly around the kind of anxiety that's nurtured in the Western world. And this is something that's been a huge problem throughout the 20th century. This is another thing where you look at the roots and the inheritance. It's really interesting that even my wife and I quite enjoy watching, even like watching old American musicals, like that where kind of around where the 50s, kind of made in the 50s, not always set in the 50s, but you often had someone, if it was a contemporary one set in the 50s, not one of the older ones like Oklahoma or something, but like you just see, or any movie really that era, often there's a psychiatrist in the movie. It's really, I can't believe how often it comes up. You've just got someone who's in showbiz or something.
That's
actually some of the plots are almost identical, but like there's often a psychiatry angle in it. And there's someone who's struggling with stuff. So this is something that people know and almost talking about at the time, but it was a cool, popular thing to have because of Freud's influence that hugely impacted the US. And because you guys had all the money and power, it became like it kind of rocket boosted this way of life. And it was just like downstream from the general sense of the self that I guess was bequeathed by the Enlightenment in general from Europe. So we're already quite, in many ways, we're very sort of self-focused anyway as Western society, and so psychotherapy, psychoanalysis just became like the next step. Like, how do I fix the stuff that's me? If I've made myself the center of existence, and therefore the self-expression matters more above everything else, above any objective truth, it would make sense that this business would thrive and flourish, even though it doesn't help the people flourish. It kind of makes me think of that I watched a movie. I didn't actually like the entirely, but I could tell there was some kind of political mischief going on in it. But that movie, Killers of the Flower Moon, that with Leonardo DiCaprio not that long ago, about kind of a movie where they were sort of, the white people were basically exploiting the Indians and taking all their money and oil. But one, which I think was based on a true story about one case, but almost made it like politically like, hey, this is what all white people do to all people who aren't white, etc. It almost felt like that was the political angle of it. But it was a horrendous situation where they were medicine was being applied to these Indian women that was making them worse. And it's like, oh, I'm so sorry, like you're getting worse. It's like that they keep going to the doctor and the doctor makes them worse. And I think there's someone that I've worked on as an academic called Soren Kierkegaard, who actually does focus on the self, ironically, and maintains a good kind of Christian individualism. There's a Christian individuality that matters, like persons matter to God. And there's a problem with crowd think. So in relation to like going along with the herd, individualism, there's a Christian way of speaking about that, but that's different to the self-focus, where the ego is the center of the universe, which you have in many respects in Western culture. So yeah, I think that's partly the problems that we're sort of dealing with here. 1 second. Speaking of, I just need to go and rescue my 3-year-old son is crying outside, so I'd be remiss. He'll probably need therapy one day if I don't help him. So 1 second.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yes, this is Elijah. He's
super cutie there.
He's going to, never work with children, they say, or animals, but I don't know what's going to happen at this point. We're going to do some psychotherapy today, boy. Yeah, no, he's just been. My wife's been out with the rest of the children, so he was down for a nap. So he's clearly emerged. He's clearly emerged. That's all right. So anyway,
okay.
So what was I saying? Yes, I was saying basically, they're books. Sorry, good.
Your books, though.
So what books am I doing? So I've got one book that I've got coming out called "Homosexuality is Invading the Church," and how did that happen? How did it happen that we've allowed the state of play to get to where it's gotten to? How did we lose that negotiating over time with the world and trying to go, actually, I agree, and just giving away more of the farm every single time? In fact, the analogy I'd often probably use is the appeasement policy that Britain applied to Nazi Germany in the 1930s. So you think of Neville Chamberlain, the prime minister, and he's thinks that he's achieved peace in our time. He's kept the peace in Europe, desperate to avoid another war, which is understandable, but at what price, at what cost? And we're going to give away a bit of Czechoslovakia. Don't worry, I won't come for the rest of it. Oh, look, other stuff's happening. Oh, but don't worry. So trying to deal with the wolves and trying to give more to the wolves and assuming they won't come back for more. And I think people have, when you give the emotional, self-therapeutically inspired story about how much we've hurt the LGBT community, you're always on the back foot. And so you're never going to come out and challenge and go, this is actually wrong. And God thinks it's worse for you. You're not going to flourish. How dare you say that? Heteronormativity is bad. Yeah. Right.
It's actually a message of love to say God has a better path and a better way for you, regardless of what your feelings are telling you right now. And one of the things when you talk about the title of the book, for example, I just want to draw a distinction. You're not talking about, obviously someone like me or my wife or the hundreds or literally thousands of people who have come out of homosexuality to follow Jesus over the years. We're talking about the way that the homosexual ideology has invaded the church, not the idea that sinners, of all stripes, including those out of the LGBT world, have come to Jesus and are in the church. That's a good thing. But the ideology coming in is actually causing great in my tweet, damage.
I could have said LGBT is invading the church. And I wonder if it probably wouldn't have caused that much trouble if I had. But I wanted to say homosexuality because I mean, there's different to saying homosexuals are invading the church. It's saying... It's actually saying in the scripture, in most of our modern translations, LGBT scholars, the kind of bureau of scholars will come and say, oh no, homosexuality is not translated properly, but there's lots of adequate responses to this. But basically homosexuality is in what most people's English translations will say. So it's completely appropriate to say homosexuality is wrong. And you're not therefore saying that the person is a terrible person entirely, but they're a sinner like we all are. But homosexuality is only ever seen negative, spoken of pejoratively, seen as something that's going to separate you from God. So, as you say, it's loving to speak the truth in that sense, and not to say, hey, you're not allowed to come into the church. It's saying, well, all of us don't get to come into the church by right. We come in because of what Christ has done, and we've repented of our sin and accepted his work on the cross for us, and his blood covers our sin. But that's we make a mockery of that very thing if we don't,
Yes.
But your contribution to the debate. Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have a couple minutes to chat about your other masculinity? I'm a huge fan of really unpacking what is not just a cultural idea of masculinity, or even I think sometimes when I see the word masculine, the biblical masculinity or biblical femininity, I'm drawn to that, but I also, a red flag goes up and I'm wondering, okay, what are we talking about here? What does that actually look like?
About David's mighty men. And again, it's a bit like this situation of us. Men are told that they're so terrible to women. They're all misogynists and chauvinists, and men are committing suicide at ridiculous rates. And lots of men are growing up believing that effeminacy is okay. Men are interrupting their fathers. I mean, this is just terrible. Like, what is the world coming to? No, and actually, funnily enough, like I would say with my young boys, I've got Elijah here who's 3, and I've got another boy, Malachi, who's 10. Your brother Malachi, and I will want to raise them as boys in the way the Bible speaks to them to act like men. And so some of those things you say that, there's worry. I agree. There's things where people have cultural stereotypes which are then mapped on, this was what it means to be a man. You have to act like this, and it becomes very stereotyped and very prescripted. This is what you can and can't do as a proper biblical man. But in the broader sense, you have to combat the effeminacy that's coming in. So when they want to throw a tantrum and when they want to cry, the therapeutic side of you going to go, they're there, it's fine. So of course I want to comfort my son if he suddenly breaks out into a tantrum. But at the same time, I want to challenge him, encourage him to kind of push on, and say, you're going to absorb some of these blows and actually and push on in the right way, not just kind of pretending everything's fine. Absolutely not. But actually saying that what you need to be there to be a source of strength for others, which is really, really important. And again, the Bible is not absent on these things. For many years, we've thought, the Bible doesn't really care either way. But Paul does say, act like men in 1 Corinthians 16. And the account of the mighty men, there's far more in there than you think that should be encouraging as heroes of the faith, that does map on to some things that have become stereotypes. So yes, there's a worldly negative version of masculine strength, Andrew Tate, etc. But there's also a biblical version too. In fact, he's just mentioned Zulu, a film that he accidentally got to see some of, which is it's a PG. So there's leeway. It's a PG. Zulu, the film. Yeah, you've watched Zulu, so he's enjoyed actually his some cultural masculinity, looking at the British Army fighting against the Zulu army in the Battle of Rorke's Drift, which is kind of a famous film. But people might think I'm radicalizing my children, but he does enjoy it. Anyway, so that's a book that will coming out, trying to go from there and go, right, how do we move from understanding what don't they mean, and how do those accounts of the mighty men map onto Jesus and his mighty men, which is the disciples. And it's a very different kind of account, but David is a type of Jesus, and there's something about gathering the men who are disenfranchised, picking them up and empowering them to go and take on the world, which is precisely what Jesus does, which is why we need to focus on that in the New Testament as well.
Yeah. Well, and I'm hopeful that that's actually something we're going to be seeing. I mean, in the face of everything that's of any strength and character, as well as the junk being toxic masculinity. I mean, it's easy to see junk and say, oh, it's all bad. But, one of the things that one of my mentors has said in some of his material is that men need to be salient. They need to be both strong and tender. And those are the kind of fathers, the husbands, the men, the brothers that we need alongside of us, are those who are actually strong, but also tender, not only strong and abusive, disconnected from their hearts, but we need both. And unfortunately, men have really been disenfranchised in huge ways. I do think that unless these are the absolute end times that we're living in and, swiftly moving toward, I do think that we're going to see a course correction in terms of understanding the insanity of the times that we're living in and the confusion around maleness and femaleness and all of that, and begin to re-embrace something that looks more like a biblical model.
Like, to protect women against the worst men who would prey upon them and take advantage of them, you need strong, godly men of character who do love them and are humble and tender-hearted as well. And I know all the gentleness that Jesus calls us into, but Jesus is a courageous man. He's a strong man as well, and he wants us to be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might, as Paul says in Ephesians 6. So absolutely, if you care about protecting women, we need stronger men to do that. And it's like, well, should you need chivalrous men to come and protect women? Well, let's just see what happens if you don't, because there's a strong wave coming from the right of people who are red-pilled men who don't see anything good in Christianity, and they'll go to the worst sources and they'll come and say, right, let's just reinstitute kind of old school masculine domination, and let's see what happens when that happens, because that's what far worse than what you think you've got now, a corrupted version of that masculine strength.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and we would say that part of what it means to be masculine, made in the image of God, is to be a covering, to be a protector. And because of sin, when that is taken to its extreme, it is abusive. And so we do need those godly men to really rise up and shake off and reject both passivity and aggression. And again, really have that salient care for the children in their lives, the women in their lives, one another as brothers, etc. So anyway, Aaron, it's been great to talk with you, and to everybody who's tuned in for this podcast episode, thank you for joining the three of us now. And we're glad that you were here. And Aaron, we look forward to connecting with you in terms of your books. What's the best way for people to stay in contact with you, or to reach out with what you're working on, what you're doing?
Yeah, so they could follow me on, they could follow my Substack blog, which is thatgoodfight.substack.com, thatgoodfight.substack.com. And I'm also on Twitter, Aaron_P_Edwards that's just Aaron. That's what my Twitter handle is. And and of course, feel free to reach out. And if you want to send a message via any of those platforms, I'm more than happy to connect and chat further. I'm in a kind of a time of sort of a transitional time where I've got flexibility to be able to sort of connect with people, and I'm speaking and writing and saying I'm working towards new forms of theological education that are going to be more robust longer term, that can allow us to be what I would call shamelessly biblical, where we sort of take on, we take the hits that are going to come, and rather than hedging our bets, we just say, look, we believe what the Bible says, and we need to apply that to life, and that's going to look awkward for some people, but we want to be the ones who are putting our stake in the ground and saying that's what we believe. So tell us what you want, and we don't mind. Yeah, I'm 38, I believe. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
You're still a young man. It's so encouraging to hear someone such as yourself at your age addressing these issues in such a clear-eyed way, and really leading a path here. We so appreciate the time you've just invested with us in our Transforming Congregations podcast. To join us for future podcasts, dial into transformingcongregations.org/podcast, and we look forward to seeing you in a future podcast.